Hello, I'm Beth Benedict, a professor at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. I'm here to talk to you about family involvement. And I got involved in the field of family involvement because I am the mother of two deaf children, one who's 26 and one who's almost 25. So believe me, I know what I'm talking about. I remember when I had my two girls, I had heard and I knew that family involvement was important. But I wasn't sure to what degree I should be involved or how even to define family involvement. So I had my own personal experience, and then I decided to study and get my PhD on the topic of family involvement. It became clear to me then, and now I'm happy to share with you what I've learned. Research has shown that family involvement is a clear predictor for academic success and lifelong success. And this applies to both hearing and deaf children. There's no difference. There are positive outcomes when families are involved. I'm going to share with you some of the different research studies that have been done, and they have the same results again. Family involvement is very important. I'm going to highlight a couple of the studies to reinforce our understanding on this topic. And we'll begin with Calderon, who studied young children, comparing those who had families who were involved and those who had parents who were less involved. Those infants who had parents who were involved outperformed those children and infants whose families were less involved. Then we move on to Bodner-Johnson's research, and she looked at the middle school age children. 125 families were studied to see what were the common themes that might emerge. Through interviews and surveys, she found that success was predicted on the basis of parental expectations. Now, this study was done in the 1980s, and the terminology family involvement was not in use then. So instead, they referred to that topic as parental expectations. Had she known the term family involvement, she would have used it. But they talked about it as parental expectations and having high expectations for your child leading to success. Then there's the third research study, looking at young adults who have graduated from high school. And the researchers were Toskamp, McKee, and Lepoutre. They looked at college students. They picked 30 top college students based on their academic success and their GPA and so forth. And they studied these 30 students. These are all deaf and hard of hearing students who were studied to find out what contributed to their success. And they came from different backgrounds, different communication methodologies, different family situations, different economic backgrounds, different ethnicities. But there was a common theme that emerged, which was that they had families who were greatly involved. And there are two more research studies I want to share with you. One is by Moeller. And Moeller's research is important to us because I believe it gives us a sense of hope, the idea that it's never too late. Moeller researched 4 different categories of children, but they can be roughly divided into 2. They were very young children, but I believe that the lesson applies to those of us who work with older kids as well. And this is a study that has to do with early intervention and newborn hearing screening. So the 2 categories were those children who were identified as deaf or hard of hearing at birth and were linked up to early intervention programs and services early. And within that group, there are 2 subsets. One group had family involvement and one group did not. The second large category were those children who were identified late, where the assumption was made that the children were hearing until a certain time. They were identified as being deaf or hard of hearing, and they were enrolled in early intervention programs later. And again, that category has two subsets, a group where parents were very involved and a group where there was not as much family involvement. Those who did well in life, you will not be surprised to find out, were that first group, identified early, family involvement. The next group of successful students, surprisingly, not the students who were identified early who didn't have family involvement, but rather the children who were identified late, who got hooked up with services later in their childhood, but whose parents were involved. They caught up and surpassed the children whose parents were less involved. So the lesson is that if families are involved, kids can catch up. And we've all heard those stories of students who have delayed language or who have been adopted from other countries and have come to the United States and have picked up language here and surpassed some of their American peers. So if you ever feel a bit despondent that maybe the kids you're working with are too old and it's too late, take heart from this study. It's never too late. Just like people who go to college later in life shouldn't be discounted. Again, family involvement is the key, and I think that is very hopeful for us, and Moeller's research is evidence of that. Finally, there's another study that you should keep in mind, undertaken by Powers and Saskiewicz. And this is a study that we really should take to heart. They looked at two groups of parents. So the first group was hearing parents with hearing children or deaf parents with deaf children. In other words, family units where hearing status was aligned. And the other group was where it was mixed, so hearing parents and deaf children. Now, you know, schools often encourage parents to come to school, to get involved, to volunteer in some capacity or another. And of course, schools do that because they want families involved. Well, what Powers and Saskiewicz's research showed is that when hearing status was aligned, so whether the parents and children were both hearing or the parents and children were both deaf, when parents went to school, they got involved, helping with arts and crafts, telling stories to the children, talking to the children, really being engaged. Whereas the hearing parents of deaf children, when they went into their children's deaf schools, they took a more passive role. They observed more than getting involved. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they were overwhelmed. They have so much they want to learn. They need models. You know, the difference between reading something or hearing something and actually seeing it in practice can be great. So they wanted to take it all in, and they should be encouraged to come in. The schools need to be welcoming. The teachers and other professionals need to make parents feel welcome. That is our job, to help them take that first step. Because they do feel awkward sometimes. They don't feel that their signing is up to snuff, or they're worried about perceptions of their parenting style. Remember, the vast majority of deaf children come from hearing parents. And even more surprising, of those children who come from hearing parents, 90% of their parents have never met a deaf person until they gave birth to one. So their own deaf child is the first deaf person they've ever met, and we cannot expect them to have the resources and knowledge and skills to know what to do. We need to help them and scaffold them to get involved. I've been talking about family involvement and its importance, but I think we need to look also at some of the possible predictors that come into this picture. What predicts family involvement and success? And the research is repetitive on this. A student's own academic abilities are important. Deaf and hard of hearing children without additional challenges have a good chance to be successful given the right supports. Students' socioeconomic situation is, of course, important to consider. And you know this to be true. If there are children who come from a family of comfortable means, they probably can afford, for example, to buy books, or they can afford to travel and introduce their children to the world. If money is limited at home, then the opportunities for getting books may be limited. However, let's not forget about the library. They don't charge a thing, and I do want to make that point. families can be creative even if they are in constrained circumstances. If you can't afford to travel, we can bring the world home by looking at maps, by reading world books. If you have access to the internet, that's wonderful, but if you don't, you can always go to the library and use their internet. So that's a way that families can be involved regardless of their socioeconomic status. Don't let those barriers be in your way. Parental expectations can't be discounted, and role models are very important. You know, many children grow up thinking that they are the only deaf or hard of hearing person in the world. They never see anybody else like them. And you know that deafness is an invisible disability, which means it's quite possible to walk on the street and maybe pass a deaf person without even realizing it, because it's not a visible situation. So these children who don't have people around them who are like them really wonder if they're alone. And that means the role models are even more important. And that's not just for the child, but it's also for the parents. If a hearing parent meets a deaf adult who seems successful, then they can have a vision for what their child can aspire to. Another predictor is the ability to communicate. We are all well aware of the links between language and communication. The ability to communicate, to express yourself, means that you can, as a child, ask those probing questions, why and how, that lead to meaningful discussions. Another predictor is employment, which may seem surprising. But it's important that children be exposed to the world of work and the variety of careers that are out there, because then they start to think about what they might be interested in doing when they grow up. They need to get ideas from people who are doing different kinds of careers so that they can start exploring in their own mind what's interesting. And in fact, I did this with my own daughters. When we had friends come over the house, when they would leave the house, I always explained to my daughters what they did for work, what career this one had or what this one did for work. And that led to my daughters thinking about kind of the vast array of jobs they might potentially be interested in. Now, there are additional predictors at the bottom of the slide, different additional variables that are probably also quite important, but they don't have research yet to substantiate them. For us, they're intuitive. We believe these are important variables and things to keep in mind. So don't just look at the top of the slide, but look at the bottom of the slide as well. Well, on this slide, we see very important points. I've been talking about family involvement, and I remember for myself, when my children were young, I knew family involvement was important, but I wasn't sure to what extent I should be involved. I wasn't sure exactly what that meant and how I would define what I was trying to do. And in my research, I came across a family involvement model by Epstein that I really, really liked. There are a list here of 6 different variables: parenting, communicating, volunteering, learning at home, decision-making, and collaborating with the community. And then, of course, for my dissertation, there's the additional 7th, which is deaf-related issues. And I'm going to talk about each in turn. So first, parenting. As you know, kids don't come with instructions, quite unfortunately. And most people don't go to classes to learn about parenting. So it's one of those jobs that you learn while doing. And that's where we as professionals and teachers and counselors have a role to play. We can really help parents with parenting skills. And parenting skills is an ongoing, lifelong process. Because when a child is first born, you have to learn the baby stuff. You know, the basic needs have to be met. Then they get into school, and parents have questions about how much should they help with homework? Should they let the child do it themselves, or should they get involved? And there are questions about discipline and how to show unconditional love. And then your child gets a little bit older, and now we start talking about transitioning to high school and transitioning after high school. Often parents think that they might be done with their job once kids reach high school, but in fact, the opposite is true. Research shows that kids need parents even more during those critical high school years, going through puberty, learning how to make decisions as a young adult, getting ready to graduate and thinking about after graduation. Parenting skills are super important all the way through. My kids, who are now 26 and almost 25, still ask us for advice. And in fact, I still ask my parents for advice, even at my age. So keep that in mind. That never ends. Next, communicating. Communicating starts at birth and doesn't stop. You want to always be in dialogue with your kids. It's the same thing as any adult relationship. Communicating is part of relationship maintenance, and the parent-child relationship is a key relationship that requires deep, meaningful communication to enhance. So things we always tell parents not to say to their deaf children are those trigger labels like, "I'll tell you later," or "I'll summarize it for you." Next, volunteering. The more families volunteer at children's schools, with the children's activities, the more they see the authentic activities of their children. You know the story of kids arriving home from school and the parent says, "How was school?" and the answer is, "Fine." That's just not sufficient for a meaningful relationship. But if parents are volunteering in the classroom, they can really ask meaningful questions, which lets the child know that the parent is interested in them and interested in their life. Sometimes if the child says school was fine and the parent says, "Okay, good, glad to hear it," that's the end of it. I have to admit I'm guilty of that sort of exchange myself. We are busy people, we don't always have time. Don't feel guilty about that, but try to have more meaningful conversations at least a couple times a week. Then there's learning at home. You always want parents to reinforce the lessons from school. So for example, if there's a particular math lesson, you can take your child to the grocery store and say, "We've got $25 to spend, what can we buy at the grocery store?" Make a game out of it. If parents know what the children are learning at school, they're more able to reinforce those lessons at home. If they don't have any idea, it's very hard to be supportive. You know, in school there are uneven ratios depending on the academic environment. One teacher to, in a deaf school, maybe 6 or 7 kids. In a mainstream school, it's one teacher to 30 or 35 kids. That makes it hard for kids to get individualized attention, which they can get at home. And if there are other adults like grandparents in the picture, even better. So learning at home is an important component. And then we need to start talking about transition when these young people are 12 or 13 years old. Maybe start encouraging them to get summer jobs so they can get some experience. They can start with babysitting or walking the dog, and then they can go perhaps work in a retail environment like selling shoes or working in a restaurant as a bus girl. In fact, my daughter's first job was selling shoes, a store called Journeys, a shoe store, and then later she worked as a bus girl in a restaurant. And that actually came about because she wanted to go to a summer camp that cost $1,500 for 10 days, which just wasn't reasonable. So we negotiated. That's part of the communication. And I said if she would go and get a job, I would pay for half of the camp. And so she went and got herself a job, and sure enough, she was able to go to camp. She came back from that experience, and in fact, since then, she has developed the habit of saving 50% of everything she earns. So that's an example of learning at home. And then there's decision-making. Parents need to be involved with schools' decision-making processes, sitting on interview committees or advising how the funding should be spent, perhaps picking the curriculum the school should get. Parents need to have their input valued. and schools need to work on that. Now, often parents may not think they have the skills to develop a curriculum, but they can be given information and tools and resources so that they can reinforce those lessons at home, and they just need to be involved at all levels of the academic experience. Then there's collaborating with the community, the resources in the community. Like I said, the library, community centers often have activities for children and families. And families often don't know that any activities sponsored by a county or a city must provide interpreters. If you want your children to be involved in this activity or go to the library storytelling hour or the swim class at the community center, they must provide interpreters pursuant to the ADA. So that's a wonderful resource as well. And again, that goes back to role models, because I remember when my kids were young, I wanted to take them to a neighborhood swim class. And I got in touch with a hearing woman who had 2 deaf children, and I invited her to join us. Well, her reaction was, I'm not going to interpret for all the kids. I can't interpret for all the kids. And I had to explain to her that the ADA was in place and we would get an interpreter through the community center, because that's what the law says. And she had no idea. So I was her role model in navigating the world as a deaf individual. Then, of course, as I said, my dissertation added the deaf-related issues. Now, research shows, and this is not surprising, that deaf schools do a better job of sharing information with hearing families. Understandably, they have the information to share. But 85% of deaf children are now in mainstream settings, and they're not getting information that specifically relates to them as deaf children. So we need to be mindful of that when we're working with this population. And those deaf-related issues can be, like I said, knowledge about the ADA and how to advocate for your rights. Assistive devices and equipment, like visual alerting systems for the phone or the doorbell, video phones, VRS, the video relay system, services system. This is a panoply of information that parents need, and it's our job as transition counselors to provide that. Because that gives children the ability to become independent as adults, and it gives parents that peace of mind that their children can be independent, because there are such things in the world, such as visual alerting devices. I've talked a lot about family involvement and that family involvement model, and I'll close with some tips and suggestions, as you see here on the slide. And as I've already mentioned, you want to be involved with the deaf community. Those children need role models for employment purposes, but also for college purposes. It's important that they see the wide variety of deaf experiences, and it helps them develop their own deaf identity. You want to get parents involved with school activities, IEPs. The children should be involved in IEPs as well. Children should really be with you all the time throughout their whole process. And the key is knowledge and empowerment. No one can take those away from you. Some further tips about family involvement during transition. You have to explain transition to parents in different ways and over multiple years and times. They will be overwhelmed. They won't remember everything. And it's important that parents network with each other, that they be involved in the IEPs, and that they know about resources, college fairs, VR, mental health services, post-secondary educational services, employment options. And you need to speak in their language. That's important. The bottom line is that family and student involvement begins at the beginning, and you need to ask and share. Don't wait for families to ask you questions. Just share, share, share away. In closing, family involvement is key. We all have to work together. We cannot succeed in isolation. We're all in this together.